Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're at the 17th installment of the Hall of Faith, part 3 of Rahab. I'm intending to make this the last part for Rahab, part 3 of Rahab. Last couple of weeks, we began our story of a woman named Rahab, a woman of faith, commended by the writer of Hebrews in chapter 11, verse 31, with these words, "By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient or unbelieving." So Rahab the harlot, Rahab the prostitute, Rahab the Canaanite woman, that's who it is. We read last week she was instrumental in the survival of 2 Israelite spies, and after Rahab and the 2 spies came to a Hesed agreement, an agreement between the 2 of them, the 3 of them, this happened. And that's the picture we showed last time. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. So the spies shimmied down the wall. Their escape would have been more difficult, if not impossible, if it had been necessary for them to go out through the city gate. Before they left, Rahab gave them some good advice about where to hide. In verse 16, she said, "Now she had said to them, 'Go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way.'" So that was her talking before they left. And also before they left, these spies spoke to Rahab. The men said to her, "This oath you made me swear will not be binding on us, unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house." So as the spies be prepared to go, they again confirmed the pact, but they also added some conditions Rahab must abide by. That first one, her house must be marked by a scarlet cord hung from the window. So why do you suppose that would be useful? A logical reason would be because of the position of the house on the city wall, the cord would be clearly seen by the Israelite soldiers every time they would march around the walls. But now remember, the spies had not heard about God's plan yet about marching 7 times around the wall and then 7 times again. As far as they knew, there might be one huge attack on Jericho. But with that plan too, Rahab's home would be clearly marked. Presumably then, the spies would relay this information to Joshua, and Joshua would then command all the soldiers, "Don't violate the oath and kill anyone in that house," the one with the scarlet. The red scarlet, the scarlet cord. Okay, and that brings us to the second condition. Rahab needed to get her family into her house. All your family into your house. And there was more to that condition. That second condition. "If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." So not only was Rahab to gather her family, but they were all to remain in the house during the attack on Jericho. Again, the spies probably figured that attack would involve conventional warfare. If anybody would wander out and was killed, the guilt for his death would be on his or her own, not the Israelite invaders. And then there's that last final condition. The spies again emphasized that they would be free of this oath of protection if Rahab exposed their mission. So what does Rahab think of these conditions? Verse 21. "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. Okay, what happens next? When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days, until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them, just as Rahab suggested. So about a half mile west of Jericho are these limestone cliffs about 1,500 feet high, honeycombed with caves. So that's probably where the spies hid in the hills for 3 days until the soldiers gave up the hunt. After that, then, the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." So I would assume under the cover of darkness, the spies swam back across the Jordan, made their way quickly to the camp at Shittim, and reported to Joshua. So their bottom line conclusion was the enemy is afraid. Hey, we got this with God's help, of course. We've got this. It was after the spies reported to Joshua that the next steps began, starting in Joshua chapter 3. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. So the Israelites' leader Joshua began immediate preparations to cross the Jordan with the intention of invading Canaan. At this point, Joshua had no idea that this huge group of people would cross, how they would cross. He knew they had to cross, but he didn't know how they would cross. He had no knowledge of the miracle God would perform. By the same token, although Joshua knew that he would have to take on Jericho, he had no clue of the unusual but powerful way they would succeed there too. At this moment, what spurred Joshua on was the great report from the two spies, and that would not have happened if not for Rahab. Okay, I'm going to continue. We're going to barrel through this. Let's go back and read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 again to remind us. Oh. Well, you remember, by the faith in prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Okay, Rahab is brought up again in Joshua chapter 6. We have that here, chapter 6, which is where we heard the whole story about the battle against Jericho. When we looked at Joshua's story a couple weeks ago, we learned about the miraculous way Jericho was taken by the Israelites. So let's go to the final stage of that miracle, as told in verse 20, Joshua 6:20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord. I think I mentioned last time when that came up. The city's contents were to be given over to the Lord by totally destroying everything, by destroying them. Make sure there was no mistake of the meaning here. It's spelled out, saying, they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Well, it almost sounds like Rahab and her family were casualties too. But no. Verse 22, Joshua said to the two men, apparently before this, everyone was slaughtered. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. So wonderful. Rahab and her family were spared as promised. Her faith put into action is what literally saved her. That faith put into action, faith in action, that is something James wrote about. In James chapter 2, verse 20, we read, you foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. James is talking about faith and actions. In verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does, and not by faith alone. So you're probably starting to think, hey, James is writing about Abraham. What's this have to do with Rahab? But we got to it now in verse 25. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So James uses examples for his doctrine that faith and action go together. Two very different people, Abraham and Rahab. Abraham was a Jew, Rahab was a Gentile, a Canaanite. Abraham was a godly man, Rahab was a sinful woman, a prostitute. Abraham was given the name friend of God. Rahab belonged to the enemies of God. The one thing they had in common, what is it they had in common? Both showed and practiced faith and action, often called works, faith and works. They didn't just have faith, they acted on it. James is saying, just like Abraham, father of the Jews, Rahab was credited as righteous. And we can be included on that list, credited as righteous, just like Abraham, just like Rahab. Rahab can be an inspiration to all of us, no matter how mature we are in Christ. When we hear the excuse to not act on something because, one excuse being, I don't know very much about the Bible, look at Rahab. She knew very little spiritual truth, but she acted on what she did know. Or how about the excuse, I'm too bad to be saved. I'm too evil to be saved. I'm too bad. I've done too much wrong. Look at Rahab. Rahab was a heathen prostitute, yet she was a woman of faith. It's amazing how God uses people who we might think would never be used by God. And I think that's God's grace for us. It brings to mind the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 that I included here. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. Well, we're winding up the story of Rahab. One more thing about Rahab I don't want us to overlook. Let's look back at that last line in Rahab's story from the book of Joshua in chapter 6, verse 25. I have it underlined there. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. So not only was Rahab delivered from judgment, delivered from death, but she became a part of the nation of Israel. How exciting is that? Rahab married Salmon and gave birth to Boaz. The guy's name is Salmon. I wonder if it's pronounced that way. Is it Salmon? Rahab married Salmon and gave birth to Boaz. And Boaz married Ruth, the book of Ruth, you may recall, and they had a son named Obed. Obed's son was Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. That makes Rahab an ancestor of David, which makes her an ancestor of Jesus. So let that sink in for us all. A pagan prostitute becoming a part of the ancestry of Jesus Christ because of her faith. So that concludes our story of Rahab and why she is commended for her faith. And so we will carry on next week with the Hall of Faith, perhaps the last one. In the meantime, take care, and may the Lord be with you.